The night air hung heavy over Chicago, thick with the scent of stale beer and forgotten dreams. It was the 15th of February 1968, but the city, usually alive with the roar of blues and the clang of late-night trains, was eerily quiet. A grim ambulance, its siren muted, pulled up to a modest apartment building on East 54th Street. Inside, a body lay still, a life extinguished not with a bang, but a whimper. Marion Walter Jacobs, the undisputed king of the amplified harmonica, was dead at 37. No screaming fans, no flashing cameras, just the hushed whispers of paramedics and the slow, heavy beat of a broken heart. This was the man who once made a tiny tin sandwich roar like a saxophone, whose music cut through the smoke of 1,000 juke joints like a switchblade. A man who drove Cadillacs until the wheels fell off, whose pockets overflowed with cash, and whose name was synonymous with the very sound of Chicago blues. He was a force of nature, a musical titan who stood toe-to-toe with electric guitars, bending sound to his will and changing the DNA of music forever. But in death, he was just another statistic, another forgotten casualty of the city that both crowned and devoured him. The official cause was coronary thrombosis, a blood clot, a quiet, natural end. But the streets, those gritty, unforgiving streets that had birthed his legend, told a different story. They whispered of a final, brutal beating, a blow to the head that finally silenced the loudest sound in blues history. His body, bruised and swollen, lay in a casket that barely contained the truth of his violent life. For decades, his grave would remain unmarked, a stark, desolate monument to a king without a crown, a genius swallowed by the very fire he commanded. This is not just the story of a musician. It's a chilling psychological autopsy of a soul trapped between the raw power of his art and the destructive impulses that plagued him. It's the tale of Little Walter, a man whose insatiable hunger for sound and validation became a deal with the devil, costing him everything but his immortal echo. His life was a symphony of chaos, a brutal testament to the lonely, unforgiving price of immortality. Before the roar, there was only the hunger. Marion Walter Jacobs was born into the humid, unforgiving embrace of Marksville, Louisiana, on May 1st, 1930. His arrival was unrecorded, a ghost in the system, born out of wedlock in a time when shame clung to such circumstances like a shroud. Abandonment was his first scar, a raw wound that would fester throughout his life. His father, a musician, eventually took him in but carried the shadow of violence, later imprisoned for shooting a man. His uncle, who also raised him, met a similar fate, shooting a white man who had killed his dog. Violence wasn't just around Marion. It was in the very soil, in the bloodline, a constant, low hum beneath the surface of his existence. Surrounded by a world that offered little comfort and much cruelty, young Marion found his escape not in solace, but in sound. By 8, music became his defiant whisper against the storm. He yearned for a saxophone, dreaming of its smooth, powerful voice. But a saxophone was a rich man's instrument. Marion was dirt poor, his reality a brutal counterpoint to his aspirations. So he clutched the only thing he could afford, a cheap, pocket-sized harmonica. It wasn't a toy. It was his weapon, his shield, his only means to bend the harsh realities of his world to his will. He didn't just play it, he fought it, blowing until the reeds shattered, then painstakingly piecing them back together, learning the fragile mechanics of sound and survival. The South, with its stifling poverty and racial tension, could not contain a spirit so wild, so desperate to be heard. By the tender age of 12, Marion was already a man in miniature, his eyes holding the wisdom and weariness of decades. School was a distant memory, foster homes a source of abuse. He yearned for escape, not just from the South, but from the very skin he inhabited. He joined the Great Migration not with a ticket, but by jumping onto moving freight trains, a young hobo clinging to the side of a boxcar, rattling northwards into the unknown. The rhythm of the rails was the only lullaby he knew, the whistle of the train a mournful song of hope and desperation. His journey was a jagged, unpredictable scar across the American landscape. He stopped in juke joints and street corners in places like Helena, Arkansas, hustling for pennies, absorbing the raw, untamed spirit of the Delta blues. Here, he met legends like Sonny Boy Williamson, who taught him that the harmonica wasn't just an instrument but a weapon of expression, a voice for the voiceless. He learned to play with a ferocity born of necessity, his notes screaming with the pain and defiance of 1,000 forgotten souls. By 1945, the rails led him to the concrete labyrinth of Chicago. He was barely 14, but his soul was ancient. He landed on Maxwell Street, the pulsating heart of the city's black market, a chaotic symphony of vendors, hustlers, and musicians. He played for tips, for scraps of food, for the simple right to exist. But Chicago offered more than survival. It offered a stage. It was here, in the crucible of urban grit, that the boy from Louisiana, now known as Little Walter, would meet a man named Muddy Waters, and together they would ignite a revolution. Destiny, a snarling beast draped in electric currents, arrived in the form of a guitar player named Jimmy Rogers. He introduced the teenage prodigy, Little Walter, to the man who would become his musical father figure and eventually his greatest rival, Muddy Waters. Muddy, already a simmering force in Chicago's burgeoning blues scene, instantly recognized the untamed fire in Walter's playing. He pulled Walter into his band, the Headhunters. And together they didn't just play music, they declared war on silence, forging the ferocious, unadulterated sound of electric Chicago blues. It was raw, it was gritty, and it felt like the very pavement of the city tearing itself apart. But Little Walter, a man whose ambition was as boundless as his talent, was never content to merely sit in the background. In the loud, smoke-filled clubs, his acoustic harmonica, no matter how fiercely blown, was often swallowed by the electric guitars and crashing drums. Walter, ever the innovator, ever desperate to be heard, did something revolutionary, something that would forever alter the course of music. He cupped a microphone tight against his harp, plugging it directly into a guitar amplifier. The result was a sound that was both terrifying and beautiful, a distorted, howling beast that no one had ever heard before. He wasn't just playing notes. He was amplifying his very soul, his rage, his yearning, his defiance, making that small instrument scream like a saxophone, wail like a siren, and cry like a heartbroken ghost. The moment of explosive breakthrough happened almost by accident. During a recording session for Muddy Waters, Walter began playing an instrumental track, a wild, untamed melody that caught the ear of Leonard Chess, the legendary boss of Chess Records. Chess heard the women dancing in the street, felt the undeniable electricity, and knew he had captured lightning in a bottle. They named the track Juke. Released in 1952, it didn't just hit the charts, it detonated, rocketing to #1 on the Billboard R&B charts and holding that coveted spot for an astonishing 8 weeks. It remains the only harmonica instrumental to ever achieve such a feat. Suddenly, the student had not only matched the master, but had outshone him. Juke became the biggest hit in Chess Records history at that time, eclipsing anything by Muddy, Chuck Berry, or Etta James. Little Walter was no longer a sideman, he was a superstar, a king crowned by the roar of his amplified harp. He launched a solo career that saw him land 14 top 10 hits, a staggering achievement for any artist, let alone a harmonica player. His 1955 anthem, My Babe, penned by the legendary Willie Dixon, even knocked Ray Charles' I Got a Woman off the #1 spot. He was on top of the world, and he lived like it. This was the era of Cadillac Records, where success was measured in chrome, horsepower, and unchecked indulgence. Walter roamed Chicago with pockets bulging with cash, his car trunks often filled with money, buying new Cadillacs every few months just to wreck them in drunken escapades and then buy another. Women flocked to him, sometimes literally fighting in the clubs for a chance to go home with the charismatic, dangerous bluesman. He was the undisputed king of the blues harmonica, his influence echoing across continents, shaping everyone from the raw energy of the Rolling Stones to the soulful virtuosity of Eric Clapton. But beneath the money, the adoring crowds, and the chart-topping hits, a storm of his own making was brewing. Little Walter was a wild boy, living a gangster lifestyle, carrying guns, drinking hard, and refusing to back down from anyone. The fame was heavy, the pressure immense, and the same untamed fire that made his music legendary was slowly, inexorably beginning to burn his life to the ground. The deal with the devil was made, and the payment was coming due. But gravity, a cruel mistress, always pulls hardest on those who fly the highest. As the golden era of the 1,950 seconds began to wane, the man who had architected the very sound of Chicago blues started to systematically tear himself apart. Little Walter wasn't just fighting for musical dominance, he was fighting everyone and everything around him. He possessed a fuse as short as a cigarette butt, fueled by what many called a Napoleon complex. When the anger took hold, a chilling transformation occurred. He would switch to speaking Creole French, a guttural, rapid-fire warning sign that violence was not just imminent but inevitable. He carried a gun in his waistband, another often tucked away in his amplifier case, always ready for a war that only existed in his own mind. The violence became a daily rhythm, as regular and relentless as a drum beat. His face, once handsome and expressive, began to bear the brutal, etched history of his nights. Jagged cuts from knife fights, deep bruises from barroom brawls, and the telltale scars of jealous lovers and enraged rivals. In one particularly tragic encounter, a gunshot wound to the leg left him with a permanent, agonizing limp, stealing the confident, swaggering stride that fans once tried to imitate. The relentless physical pain, coupled with the deeper psychological wounds, drove him further into the bottle, swapping the fleeting high of success for the numbing oblivion of moonshine and eventually the insidious, dark grip of heroin. Yet, the streets of Chicago inflicted damage that no doctor, no matter how skilled, could truly fix. In a harrowing incident of shocking police brutality, officers beat him so severely with nightsticks that they split his scalp wide open, leaving him unconscious and bloody in his own car, a grotesque tableau of a fallen king. The doctor's prognosis was chilling. The brain had suffered too much trauma. Another severe beating could very well be fatal. His body, once a vessel of boundless energy and musical genius, was physically breaking down. His lungs, once capable of holding the powerful breath needed to blow the harmonica that made him a legend, struggled, wheezing with every strained note. To compound his personal tragedy, the world of music, an entity as fickle as a lover, was moving on without him. By the late 50 seconds and early 60 seconds, the teenagers, the lifeblood of the music industry, weren't buying blues records anymore. Their ears were tuned to the electrifying, rebellious sounds of rock and roll. Artists like Chuck Berry, ironically, another chess record star, were taking over the airwaves, their catchy riffs and youthful energy eclipsing the raw, visceral pain of the blues. Little Walter, the innovator, washed in a haze of alcohol and despair as the very sound he had helped pioneer was repackaged, watered down, and sold to a new generation that barely knew his name. His records stopped selling. The once overflowing stream of income dwindled to a trickle, then dried up entirely. The parade of shiny Cadillacs, once a symbol of his opulent success, disappeared, replaced by the grim reality of poverty. Even his loyal band members, weary of his erratic, violent behavior, the constant money disputes, and the crushing weight of his self-destruction, began to quit, one by one, leaving him increasingly isolated. He became a tragic figure, a king in exile within his own city, haunting the very clubs where he once reigned supreme. He was often seen drunk, stumbling, or passing out in front of the same fans who had once worshipped him, their admiration curdling into pity and sorrow. The frustration was palpable, a bitter taste in his mouth. He was only in his mid-30 seconds, yet he looked decades older, his face a roadmap of scars, his body worn down by a life lived too fast, too hard, and too violently. The roaring sound of his success had been replaced by a deafening silence, a cruel, mocking echo of what once was. The price of immortality was proving to be everything. By the late 1960 seconds, a cruel irony enveloped the music world. While Chicago blues was fading into obscurity in America, dismissed as old folks music, it was exploding across the Atlantic. In England, a new generation of young white musicians, hungry for raw, authentic sound, worshipped Little Walter and Muddy Waters as gods. The Rolling Stones, who famously named themselves after a Muddy Waters song, and guitar virtuoso Eric Clapton, meticulously studied every note Walter played, desperate to capture that elusive, amplified magic. In 1964 and again in 1967, Walter toured Europe, playing to packed houses that treated him with a reverence he had long lost at home. But you cannot run away from yourself. Even amidst the adulation of European fans, the wild boy reputation, the shadow of his self-destruction, followed him like a persistent hound. Reports circulated of him being constantly drunk, his temper flaring, culminating in a legendary incident where he reportedly pulled a knife on a young Rod Stewart during a dispute. He felt misunderstood, a stranger in a strange land, telling people he hated London because he believed they didn't truly appreciate him, despite their thunderous applause. He was a man out of time and place, too wild, too damaged for the burgeoning new industry, yet too broken for the old one. He returned to Chicago, back to the harsh, unforgiving reality of the South Side. The money was gone. His health was shattered. His body a battlefield of old wounds and new ailments. At only 37, he looked decades older, a ghost haunting the streets he once owned. On the night of the 14th of February 1968, during a break from a performance at a small club, Walter found himself drawn into one last, inevitable fight. The details remain a dark legend of the blues. Some say it was over a dice game, others a petty dispute over a watch. What is known is that he was struck in the head, some claim with a pipe, others a hammer. It was a blow that would deliver the final, fatal act of his tragic life. True to his tough, defiant nature, he didn't go to a hospital. He dismissed the searing pain, telling friends he merely had a headache. He returned to his girlfriend's apartment at 209 East 54th Street, a quiet, unassuming place far from the roaring crowds. He lay down to sleep, convinced that rest would mend the latest wound. He never woke up. The official death certificate, a cold, clinical document, listed coronary thrombosis, a blood clot in the heart, and stated there were no external injuries. But the streets of Chicago knew better. His friends and family, gathered at his wake, saw a body so swollen in a casket that it barely resembled the man they knew. It was a quiet, confusing, and ultimately solitary end for the loudest harmonica player on earth. The man who had helped build the empire of chess records died with little money, no justice, and became another tragic casualty in the long, mournful history of American music legends. The tragedy of Little Walter did not end with his last breath. It lingered, a bitter chord in the blues symphony. At his funeral, the chaos of his life followed him into death. Grief twisted into anger as his sister reportedly lashed out at Muddy Waters, blaming the music industry and his supposed friends for letting him fall so far, so hard. For decades, the man who had electrified the blues, whose sound had roared across continents, lay in a grave without a headstone, buried in the ground like a common stranger, his resting place as silent and forgotten as his final hours. It wasn't until 1991, 23 years after his death, that loyal fans finally raised enough money to mark his eternal resting place, a heartbreaking testament to his enduring impact and the industry's neglect. Yet, you cannot bury a sound like his. Even though he died tragically young, at only 37, Little Walter changed the very DNA of music forever. Before him, the harmonica was often relegated to a folk toy or a background instrument. After him, it became a lead voice, a weapon capable of standing toe-to-toe with the electric guitar, roaring with the power of a full horn section. His groundbreaking instrumental Juke was eventually inducted into both the Grammy Hall of Fame and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, cementing his status as the greatest to ever touch the harp. Today, his story has found new life through films like Cadillac Records, where actor Columbus Short delivered a haunting portrayal that many believe deserved an Oscar. While the movie captured the wild spirit of the wild boy, the reality was even deeper, darker. His legal legacy continues to be fought over, with his daughter battling for the rights to an estate that for so long lay fallow. But the true inheritance he left behind isn't money. It is the courage to be different, the audacious spirit to bend the rules, to make the impossible sound. Little Walter proved that you don't need expensive equipment or a polished pedigree to change the world. You just need a sound that is true, raw, and undeniably yours. He took the humid pain of Louisiana, the rhythmic violence of the train tracks, and the brutal honesty of the Chicago streets, and he blew it all through a tiny metal box. He is gone, but every time you hear a blues band crank up an amp, or a rock star bend a note on a harp, you are hearing his immortal echo, a haunting reminder of the genius and the devastating price of an unforgettable sound.